Hello and welcome to this review of the Derrings historical romance book series by Sophie Jordan. I'm Olivia, your favorite resource for book recommendations you can easily screenshot, and you're watching Random Olive Reads. First up is Once Upon a Wedding Night, which is book one. Meredith is a widow to an earl, and she's worried that the new earl is coming to take over the estate and kick her and her aunt and her father out. She and her aunt come up with a plan to make it seem like she's pregnant with the next heir so that she can stay on the estate. Nick is the younger half brother of the previous earl who has been found out in his gambling hell and told that he's the new earl. Nick wants nothing to do with being a titled gentleman and wants to pass it on to someone else. He is somewhat relieved to find that he might not be the next earl after all if Meredith delivers a son. Now, Meredith and Nick are terribly attracted to each other, but he goes back to London to avoid her. When he learns that she has deceived him, he's brutally vindictive and insists that she marry somebody else to become someone else's problem. Except that he gets jealous and desires her for himself. Both characters here are extremely stubborn and don't want to fall in love, and both have seen the pitfalls of falling in love, so they try to avoid it as much as possible. Too Wicked to Tame is book two of the series. Now, after five unsuccessful seasons, Portia is sent off to the country to make a match with Heath, a bachelor earl. Now, that earl has no interest in marriage whatsoever because he believes that a madness runs through his family and he will not subject the next generation to that sort of illness or disease. Even though Portia is not interested in marriage, he thinks that she's trying to trap him and he tries really hard to resist her until one day he can't. I'm not really sure if this counts as enemies to lovers or not, but there's definitely animosity here and him being totally stubborn and not believing her when she says she's uninterested in marriage. I did enjoy reading about Heath's conniving grandmother and seeing her throw these two together as often as possible. One Night with You is book three of the series. We have an oppressed widow, Jane, who accidentally sees her childhood friend Seth at a scandalous masked party that her friends dragged her to attend. Seth had previously been in love with Jane's sister and was humiliated by her family before going away to war. Upon his return to the country, he finds out that his father and older brother had passed away, leaving him the Earl and responsible for his blind younger sister. Now, Seth is interested in a tryst with the masked lady he met at the ball, but he is also simultaneously looking for a respectable wife that can cause no heartbreak whatsoever and help protect his sister. When he meets Jane again in the daylight, he's attracted to her but refuses to become entangled with her and her family. It's interesting to see how Jane steps away from her terrible circumstances through the support of her friends. I also liked hearing more about Seth's sister and her secondary romance within the book, even though Seth was basically a stubborn idiot for most of the book. Surrender to Me is book four of the series. Now, Lady Astrid's fugitive of a husband left his family years ago, but has been spotted in Scotland under an assumed name and is ready to marry some other heiress. Astrid somehow feels responsible and runs off to Scotland to confront the man. Along the way, she meets Griffin, who rescues her from highwaymen. For the most part, Astrid is trying to cling to propriety and avoid any physical or emotional entanglement with Griffin. She's got a tragic backstory of her own with her mother who left her family for an unsuitable man, and then a father who was rigid and forced her to be proper and unfeeling. Astrid pretty much believes that following any emotions will lead to ruin and scandal, so she kind of always follows the rules. Meanwhile, Griffin is dealing with his own issues, but his need to protect Astrid becomes his priority. The story has Griffin being the one to pursue a physical relationship with Astrid despite her protests, and this one's a little dodgy here in terms of consent, reading it now in 2023. It's still an interesting story, especially as we find out more about Griffin's family and the shady dealings of Astrid's husband. Now, this was the first series from Sophie Jordan, published between 2006 and 2009. The plots have a lot going on within the same book, which makes for interesting reading. Almost like there are two phases of stories within each book. That means, though, the books don't easily fall into kind of pre established romance tropes. While the books are related to each other by some common characters, this series is not very tightly connected. We're introduced briefly to the Daring family in the end of book 1 with their dire financial situation, but then book 2 jumps about 5 years later with our main Daring character Portia. We meet her sister-in-law Astrid briefly here, but then jump to one of Astrid's friends in book 3 before finally getting to Astrid's story in book 4, which is another like 5 years removed from book 2. With the very weak connection between the books, they make plenty of sense to read as standalone. One thing to note here is that sometimes it felt like the male character of the stories were a little bit too insistent on physical pursuit of the female character without clear and explicit consent. This is likely a product of the time of publication, but would not likely be written as such in the 2020s. If you can ignore that part a little bit, you still have an enjoyable set of stories to read. Thank you so much for watching this video. Links to all the books I talked about are in the description box below. Like and subscribe so you don't miss future videos, and you can follow me on Instagram at randomolive.